Today's topic with Dr. Duke is children and how children, malleable, impressionable children, are really bearing the burden of the progressive world's angst. We have decided, at least the global progressive movement, and that includes Democrats and progressives in America, we have decided in a very unfair way that we're going to treat little children like adults, and we're going to burden them with the guilt, with the responsibility for fixing problems, made-up problems like global warming, and real problems in the world. We put the onus on children. There was a time not so long ago that the purpose of being a parent was to shield kids from anxiety, was to shield kids, you little kids in particular, from the kind of information that was going to be the stuff of nightmares. Let me share with you my own problem with this. Back in the 1970s, when I was a very little boy, I remember being in second grade, and all I remember about second grade, I don't remember anything else, 7 years old, was we spent about 2 weeks in one of my classes. I don't even know what class it was because there's no really way you should be able to fit something like this into an elementary school classroom. But I remember taking 2 weeks during a semester to talk about how the world was about to freeze to death. This is in the mid-'70s, 1975 or so, 75. This is right when, by the way, Time magazine was releasing covers that touted the new global freezing, the coming ice age. As early as 1970, as early as the early 1960s, actually, climate activists had begun to argue that the world was going to freeze. We're all going to freeze to death. The glaciers were going to sweep down from the Arctic, and they were going to push people off the land. It was just brutal. And I remember being 7 years old, and I don't know what class I was robbed of. I don't know if it was a math class or an English class, I don't know what it was. But I remember specifically the teacher going through this workbook with us about global freezing and about how all the world was coming to an end because of man-made behavior. And all I remember about my second grade year was being terrified, guilt-ridden, angst-driven. I remember I used to have night terrors. I would wake up in the middle of the night at 7 with this grim visage of a 6-mile-high glacier just pushing me and my family into the ocean to drown. And that's the kind of hysteria. As early as the mid-1970s, we were in, and I guarantee you my parents had no idea. My parents had no idea that as a 7-year-old, I was being exposed to this kind of ideology. And it had a tremendous toll on me, so much so that it's all I remember about that year. And now when you fast forward 40, 50 years, we find that what we're doing to the kids is even more extreme. We are terrifying children. It was just, 10, 15 years ago that An Inconvenient Truth, that stupid movie, a movie with, over 100 documented untruths in it, was being pushed on kindergarten kids. You had little children coming home from kindergarten bawling in tears, demanding of their mothers, why are we letting polar bears die? Why are we not doing anything? And, in this propagandistic movement, Al Gore would show a lone polar bear sort of in the middle of the sea. You couldn't see any dry land or ice or anything. And the polar bear is kind of sitting all bunched up on this little floe of ice, almost barely big enough for him to be able to stand on it. And this was proof to 5- and 6-year-olds that polar bears were starving, that there was nothing to eat, that all the ice had melted, and these poor polar bears were either going to starve to death or they were going to drown, as if polar bears can't swim for up to 150 miles to find food. That kind of dishonesty is dishonesty designed to break the hearts of mothers and dads. It's not about the kids. Traumatize the children, and then let the children take their trauma back home to the parents. And you're a mom, you're a working mom, you're a single mom in a household, you're a dad and a mom that are working two jobs to try to make ends meet. And your kids are coming back home from school, and they're horrified, they're terrified, they're anxious, they're nervous. We're slapping these kids on Ritalin, we're diagnosing them as developmentally disabled, we are terrifying them in their own schools. But we're doing it for the most selfish of reasons. We know that these little kids are too young and they're too abstract as thinkers. Little babies can't begin to think abstractly until they get up there, right? Until 7, 8, 9, 10 years. To get them at 5, 6, and 7 and teach them this stuff is to make them to believe something even though they have no critical faculty to be able to reject it. They can't argue against it. You tell little kids this kind of stuff, they are literalists, and they believe it. And so these kids come home to mom and dad are busy and they're stretched and they're financially stretched. And the anxiety of the kids becomes the crusade of the parents, right? What can we do? How do we help this? How do we fix this? It's a way of empowering and politicizing moms and dads. I mean, take the case of Greta Thunberg. The 16-year-old autistic girl from Sweden who came over here guzzling a lot of carbon credits, which were offset, we're told, right? Bringing her retinue and flying and sailing over here and lecturing the United Nations and lecturing the American people about our greed and how we stole her childhood. Let that sink in. You're very progressive mom and dad. And what is she basically saying? You, America, you, the West, you've stolen my childhood in the middle of her childhood, right? Her childhood is preoccupied with these concerns and really bad information, all right, about how she uttered the damnable lie that in 12 years we're all going to be dead. This kind of nonsense was not put in her head by American capitalists. It was not put in her head by first world lifestyles. It was put in her head by progressive media, by her schools, and by her progressive parents. The idea that we scare these kids to death and then the kids become climate heroes, right? Because, as we've said in different formats in this program, it's very hard to criticize children, even when they lie. When we know that the lies and the mistakes and the faulty science and the propaganda that children have been fed, we know enough not to blame the children. They didn't do this to themselves. It was done to them. I guarantee you that if what my experience in the 1970s were happening now, and I took my concern for global freezing outside of my school, if I orchestrated a walkout in my elementary school to protest global freezing, I guarantee you my teachers would have loved that. I would have gotten all kinds of attention. And that's the sad thing, moms and dads. Little children crave attention. They need your attention. They need your love. They need your attention and your love to grow. They need your engagement with them to become balanced and stable and well-adjusted people. And yet, what are we doing? What kind of parental malfeasance is it that we allow public school teachers what does the average second grade public school teacher know? What did, back in 1975, my second grade teacher, her name was Mrs. Sturbaum. Remember that. What did Mrs. Sturbaum know about geothermal climate? Nothing. Global climate, absolutely nothing. She was reading lessons from a handwritten script. We had a textbook that like just like the ones today that make all the right radical left-wing talking points. And this is what they felt comfortable doing to me at 7 years old. You're doing it now to your kids as well. And what kind of parenting allows us to go on in the public schools they send their kids to? And what kind of parent is it that allows these hag-ridden, driven, overly anxious, neurotic kids now to leave one unsafe space, the classroom, where they're getting nothing but tormented, to go back home where there are so many parents so eager to capitalize on their fame? We had a mom in England, the UK, who was a nurse, who was on the news this week bragging that her child, her little boy, at the age of 3, decided that he wasn't a little boy, he was a little girl. And as far as she knows, as she bragged, her name was Janine, right? Nurse Janine. This was the youngest transgender person in the history of the country, as far as she knew. And this was a big deal for her. She was proud of her 15 minutes of fame. She was proud of the fact that she was a woke enough parent to allow her 3-year-old to decide its own gender. Well, you and I both know, right, that the only way a 3-year-old has these kinds of crises if he or she lives in a home that does not take the time to reinforce reality with that child. This fairy tale mind of this very little kid was manipulated by a very messed up mother, and to the shame of us all, a mother who considers herself an actual nurse. This is what we're doing to kids. Here I am, 35 years later, here I am still haunted by the idea of what my elementary education had become in the mid-1970s. I mean, I'm a functioning adult. I don't have to see a psychiatrist. I'm not on medicine. But every time I think back to that time in my life, I think about the scare tactics. And I watch what's happening to little kids across the country right now, and it is unacceptable. Greta Thunberg is owed an apology, and she is owed a wake-up call. to not give her both, one, apologize for what was done to her, and educate her to the realities of life in the world, then we have done nothing more than abuse that child on a global level, not just on a Swedish level, not just on a family level, not just on a UN level, but on a global level we've exploited her. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Dr. Duke with the New American Magazine, and this has been my take on the news.